Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to a Dragonflight video where I'm going to discuss raid compositions that I'm expecting to see in the first tier. I want to caveat this by saying, normally at the start of a patch, I often put out tier lists, predictions of what I think is going to be good. I didn't do that for the first patch of Shadowlands though, for 9.0, and I don't plan to do it here for 10.0 either because there's too much information that I just don't feel like I have a good grasp of, and too many moving parts that I think I at least haven't got enough. I haven't been playing enough beta to feel really confident about putting out something like that. It's possible if I'd played every spec a lot on beta, I'd maybe feel comfortable there. Although even then, so much changes every single week on beta that I think it's the kind of thing that I'm likely to come back to prediction tier lists, but probably for 10.1 rather than 10.0. So with that being said, what is this video actually going to be about if it's not going to be that then? Well, despite the fact that we don't know a lot about the relative balance of certain specs, or the information we do have is likely to change, there is still a lot that we do know based off of fundamental characteristics of classes and specs, which they've actually moved a little bit more into in Dragonflight, which I think is a bad thing, of certain specs being effectively mandatory for high-end rating. I want to define high-end rating here by, really high-end. I mean guilds that are planning to kill mythic bosses before they receive substantial nerfs. So guilds for whom a 3% throughput increase is something that is, non-negotiable. We need this in our comp. Versus a guild that was 3% damage increase. The difference between just our good mage and our bad mage is more than 3% of the raid's overall damage, right? So those sorts of guilds are not really what I'm talking about here, but guilds in the race to world first, guilds in the world top 100, guilds pushing for Hall of Fame, that kind of stuff, I expect to see most of the things that I'm going to say here be true for them. So when it comes to raid composition, there are several raid buffs that effectively are mandatory for guilds like that because, so for instance, Demon Hunter, right? A Chaos Brand effect, 5% increased magic damage. You can't just leave that on the table because that like a Havoc Demon Hunter doing half the DPS of any other DPS, but applying Chaos Brand to the boss is your most valuable player when you actually look at how much damage they're contributing across the rest of the board. So one Demon Hunter of some kind is basically a requirement you'll always see. Now, the fact that you need just the one for the Chaos Brand creates an interesting dynamic where the likelihood of Havoc being brought by top-end guilds is largely based on, not just how good Havoc is, but how good is Vengeance, right? And similarly, the likelihood of Vengeance being brought, if Havoc is really bad, Vengeance gets a lot more appealing. If Havoc is really good, Vengeance gets a lot less appealing. So the two of them have an interesting relationship like that, and then only when they're both good do you start considering bringing both specs. So for now, we'll just put this in, and it's not actually either spec, but let's just say DH. A DH of some kind is certainly going to be in every top comp. Similarly, a warrior, we don't know for sure. I'm going to put in just the tank one, but again, this could be any warrior. Oops, I've deleted it instead of editing the name. Okay, warrior, because Battle Shout. And now, some raids, you play very little physical damage. It happens much more often than playing no magic damage, but it is extremely rare for that to be... Not extremely rare, but it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare to be not playing a comp that benefits from Battle Shout, because even if you're playing mostly ranged, you'll usually have a hunter or two in there, and usually a couple melee that like the Battle Shout effect, which is enough to make the warrior worth bringing, not to mention the power of Rallying Cry, which is certainly something strong as well. So one warrior of some kind coming in, again, whether that's your tank, whether that's a DPS player, depends on those multiple variables of how all of those specs are, and even how good Brewmaster is, because you also want a monk, and how good Brewmaster is depends on how good Windwalker and Mistweaver is, right? If those specs are bad, then Brewmaster gets really important, and then Prot Warrior and Vengeance get less important, and then Havoc and Fury and Arms get more important. And so it creates this really interesting, but also very annoying to be one of the players who's choosing your spec based off of this dynamic for those guilds. So you do want some monk of some kind. Could be a Mistweaver, could be a Windwalker, could be a Brewmaster, but the Mystic Touch debuff. Again, Mystic Touch and Battle Shout, some comps would sometimes drop both of these if you're playing very little physical damage, but one of each of these specs or each of these classes is extremely likely to just always see play, and this has been true going back the last couple of expansions. Now, right now, I have them in this raid comp as Vengeance, Prot, and Windwalker based just off of how beta's been feeling recently, but that could very easily change. That's the sort of thing that, is not Not something I'm trying to make a prediction about here. That's why I've done this rename thing. Similarly, a rogue of some kind. Rogue has gotten Atrophic Poison, which they can talent into. Any rogue spec can talent into this, and it gives you a 3% damage reduction as a poison on the boss. Some bosses deal damage to you that's coded as environmental that won't be affected by this, but most damage that is done to you by bosses is done to you by the boss itself. And so that is something that reducing that by 3%, especially with the recent change to increase player health and monster damage, this is now even more kind of heals worth of damage reduction that's being brought by a rogue. So let's actually move these. Let's do group 2 will be melee, group 1 will be tanks, and then group 3 will be ranged, group 4 will be healers, and then we'll fill all the rest of it with ranged, all the extra slots with ranged. That's sort of a normal comp if you look at world first kills, top 100 kills for the past few tiers, for the past few expansions. Usually a typical number is something like 2 tanks, some amount of healers, 5-ish melee, the rest ranged, and that's fairly normal. Let's talk a little bit about the some amount of healers part of things. Usually the start of an expansion, we see more healers, and then as the expansion goes longer, we start seeing healers getting cut. That was the trend over BFA especially, but a little bit in the other expansions as well. It was sort of subverted in Sepulchre, the first ones, where Blizzard came in and was like, just kidding, you got a lot to heal. And similarly, this change to player health bars, making it so that basically healing got nerfed, is very likely to mean that I expect that this is going to be a tier where we mostly see 4 or 5 healers on most encounters, maybe 6 on particularly healing intensive ones, but probably around that 4 or 5 mark, rather than going down to like the 3 or 2 heals, which is more typical of extremely spiky burst damagey fights like Queen Ajara, where you saw guilds dropping down to 2 or 3 healers. That sort of thing is, I think, less likely to be how this tier looks. So which healers kind of have a raid spot? My guess is that Holy Paladin, and then a priest of some kind, but probably on most fights, a disciplined priest. I feel like these 2 spots among top guilds are pretty likely to be true, even if they buff or nerf the specs by a little bit. The power of the Devotion Aura passive plus the Aura Mastery active, the power of Barrier, these damage reduction cooldowns, I think have gone up massively with this 40% change to player health and damage, player health and monster damage, making damage reduction effects count for more heals, basically. If you haven't seen that change, they increased all of our health bars by 40%, and they increased the incoming damage by 40%, but they didn't increase flat healing. So something that reduces incoming damage is now effectively going to reduce the amount of heals you need by more. So I think these 2 specs, I would be surprised to see them not seeing at least 1 copy in a lot of comps. But I think that the other 2 or 3 healer specs are a little bit more wide open. There are a little bit more possibilities there. In terms of other spots that I think are pretty likely, a druid of some kind, but probably a balanced druid historically, is likely to come in. Druid is bringing Mark of the Wild now for 3% versatility, so that is a class that I think you won't be passing up on, but it's pretty rare for groups to not have a druid. Just like if you look at most guilds, you got a couple of druids at least in most of them. So I don't think Mark of the Wild is going to be something that guilds will be struggling to find. Usually of the druid specs, it's kind of the balanced druids that usually have a spot, again, pending balance. It could be a rare tier where we see Feral doing a lot more damage, but Feral being in melee has to be doing a lot more damage to have a spot over balance usually, because even if like the sim or the patchwork for Feral is quite a bit better than balance, a lot of raid fights will just reward the kind of balance, ranged ability, and lower loss of throughput when doing mechanics. And then Guardian is a spec that, unless pending substantial changes to the version on beta, I don't think I'd expect to see it too much in raid. And Rest Druid could be your source of Mark of the Wild as well, but for now we'll put in the balance as kind of a prediction here, but caveat that this could be any druid for sure. Similarly, mage, I'm going to put in fire mage here, but could be any mage spec based on tuning and based on the fight, but arcane intellect, not something you're going to be passing up. And a warlock, again, the specs here, I guess I'll actually just change this to warlock mage for these, because I'm not trying to make any kind of claim about the specs of these classes. I'm just saying your comp will need one of these. And when I say your comp, I mean like the top end comps, right? If you're playing in a guild that is progressing mythic very casually, or progressing heroic, absolutely not something that is needed. Although if you're playing without summons, I pity you. That sucks. But the health stones even brought by the warlocks are huge, and the summons, TBH, that saves you a lot of time of your valuable raid progression schedule. So where does this leave us? Well, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 spots that I think are pretty hard locked in. Although, again, I'm describing the warrior spot, which could be one of 3 different warrior specs being locked in. The other options here, I think, are all much less mandatory. The other things you could be doing here are much less mandatory. I think you're looking at 2 to 3 healer flex spots over here, depending on the fight. I've liked the look of Preservation recently, but you could do whatever you want. You don't need an Evoker, I don't think. They don't provide any, their raid buff and cooldown effects are good, but not mandatory, I don't think. Not the kind of thing like Atrophic Poison or Devotion Aura, where it's okay, we're trolling if we don't have this. But something like this, I'll put this down here as kind of like the option, the parts that I'd say are more optional, but kind of my guesses now for how the comp kind of rounds out. And then I'd say probably another priest or another paladin. I guess I'll put in the priest here. You know what? Let's just put 5 healers in. We'll just make some guesses about the healers there. And then maybe for the ranged DPS, let's say maybe a Devastation Evoker, maybe another mage, another warlock, that kind of stuff. Could be, again, hunters as well, coming in of some kind. For the melee spots, Wind Fury Totem remains in the game, remains strong. If your other melee DPS are scaling well with Wind Fury Totem, that's the kind of thing where it actually does get pretty compelling to bring one. Oh, I realize now. Sorry that I had these a little bit out of frame. Let me scroll down and show you there what we're working with. But yeah, some kind of shaman. It's kind of maybe if you're playing specs that benefit from Wind Fury, these will be representing quite a lot of DPS. Maybe some kind of extra warriors, that kind of stuff, filling out those spots. A Death Knight of some kind. A couple fights where it looks strong, and also AMZ is a pretty powerful cooldown as well. So while I don't have them as mandatory, I do think it's fairly likely you'll see some DKs showing up around the place. I'm not trying to say 3 tanks or anything like this, just putting some specs down here to illustrate the point. So these are, I guess, some of these are more strong predictions than others, but really the top bit here, these groups 1 through 4 represent, I'd say, kind of these are things that I would be pretty surprised if more than 1 or 2 of these classes or specs didn't appear in top comps. And then these are kind of like the most likely filler that I think will occupy the spots that are not filled up here, that I would describe as kind of flex spots. But we will have to see how it all turns out. Hugely dependent on those last tuning patches. You'll see, there's a lot of space here. There's many slots. You could throw in 3 Unholy DKs if they're OP into this spot. You could throw in 5 Unholy DKs. You could throw in 6 Warlocks, anything like that. There's still a lot of space for extra classes, but being one of these spots, being one of these people is nice, because if you're your guild's only rogue, I think, unless you start really inting, that Atrophic Poison that you're bringing means your raid spot is pretty secure compared to being, one of the guild's hunter or something like that, which your raid spot there is going to be much more dependent on personal play and balance of the spec. So that's my thoughts on Dragonflight compositions. I hope you found this video somewhat interesting. We will see, of course, how it all turns out. I guess I will try and come back. We will look at the world, the world top 5 Razageth kills and see how they line up with these predictions. Again, the tank versus DPS versus healer for DH Warrior Monk. Those are not solid predictions. Those are placeholders, but we'll see how that lines up with this. And then maybe I'll pick out some of the other world top 100 kills as well and see how that lines up as well. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.